Just
My
checking.
name is Gioia, often going by the name of Gioia like joy. Maybe that's easier to remember. I'm here as a senior organizational change manager for Base Life Science. It's a company based in Denmark, right now expanding all over the world, soon, or actually right now in the US as well. But what I have been and what I am in my free time is that, well, I have been a human-centered designer. That's why I'm here as well. I've been a business analyst, but in my free time or in my side projects, I've been a time designer and an analog astronaut. And of course, these things combine, and that's why I'm here today to talk to you about this.
Okay, I'm very keen to know what a time design and analog astronaut is, but I will leave you to explain. Thank you.
Thank you. So I call myself being interdisciplinary. And as a designer, I have been the crew commander of an analog astronaut mission. And as an organizational change manager, I ensure that people adapt to new systems and to new processes effectively. And recently, I've been actually combining both. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about the analog astronaut mission. So this is the Lunares Research Station. It's actually located in Poland. And it's technically an old Cold War hangar that has now been converted to be the simulation of a space mission. Over here on the right, you can see that it's a dome. That's exactly the dome that I spent living in isolation with no access to natural light for 2 weeks with a crew of 4 other members. And on this side, that's where we carried out the simulations of doing moonwalks, extravehicular activities. What that means is that we were under that dome for 2 weeks with 4 other strangers we had never met before. We were following a strict mono diet, basically eating the same foods every day that were either canned or frozen. Since we had no exposure to natural light, we had to supplement ourselves with lots of vitamins. We had to follow daily medical checkups and psychological surveys every single day. And then we had to carry out these extravehicular activities, basically wearing mock-up suits and following some missions that mission control would tell us to do. At the same time, we had to follow some studies. We had to contribute to studies that were either done by university or test out things that would have later on been sent to the International Space Station, like tools on how to train when you don't have any gravitational force. And personally, I joined because I've been very interested in time, and I will tell you a little bit more about that. So the reason why I think that this is interesting and why I wanted to bring it up with you is that the message I want to share with you is that a revolution in one industry can begin from an idea from a different industry. And in most cases, it will not be perfect, but the mere act of comparing and combining will spark new lines of thinking. And if we take from the field of organizational psychology from Adam Grant, he taught us that the most promising ideas often start with novelty and gradually they incorporate familiarity. And in a similar way, I will do this to you today, talking about space and ending it with giving you 5 principles that you can apply in your everyday work, either as change designers or user experience designers. And I'm definitely not the first one. And I will not be the last one to share this message. So Cardinal Health, for example, recently launched in the US some surgical gowns with pockets. Now, that's nothing revolutionary, but it's new. Imagine that there were no patents filed until a few months ago for having pockets in surgical gowns. And let it be because the medical suppliers didn't understand the importance of having these pockets, or because we didn't believe that we had the technology to ensure that the elements would keep sterile once you put them inside. But it took the brainchild of a surgeon that used to be a mechanic in a garage to understand that this is essential to have to ensure that there is no contamination, and that you can play the choreography of surgical operations in a more effective way to lead this through. And perhaps a bit controversially, I'm here to tell you that it's not going to be the hackathons that you're going to join, or the innovation seminars that you're going to join, or perhaps a UX conference that you're going to join that is going to take you to revolutionary breakthroughs ideas. Because the very next day or on Monday, you will have to go back to the office and get back to the mental space of being productive, the productivity culture. And as an organizational change manager, that's exactly what I need to fight almost. What you have to create is to ensure that you have a mental space that people can go to, and they are able to explore new ways of thinking, to explore new ways of working, and to adapt to them. Just take a think about how much we have developed, how fast have we developed and advanced in technology in the last decade. But what have we done to speed our adoption to change? So that's why I want to share with you 5 principles that I've learned from the space industry and that you can apply every day in your job, that I'm doing as well as an organizational change manager. But you still might be wondering, why space? Well, space is an incredible environment because it enables you to turn the invisible things visible, meaning that you have to question every single thing that you're doing, because even though you take it for granted on Earth, for example, you can't do that in space. For example, how do you eat? You have to very much question, how do you even eat? Because this is how food behaves in space. And bear in mind, this is just honey. Imagine more complex food. Or think about, how do you sleep when there is no gravity, when you're seeing 16 sunrises and sunsets in 24 hours? And if we borrow from the field of physics, from the godfather of quantum physics, Niels Bohr, there's a quote that I've been carrying with me for the past 5 years, and that is, no, you're not thinking, you're just being logical. Logic being one of the most common ways that we think, yet not the only one. But because we use it every day, we start to give it for granted. So it reminds me of the first time that I almost experienced this. And that was when, from Italy, where I'm from, I had moved to Denmark to study. And I wanted to impress my flatmate. I wanted to prove to her that I didn't know only how to cook Italian food, but I knew how to cook different types of food. So I called up my mom and I was like, Mom, I want to impress my flatmate. How can I cook a turkey? And she was like, Gioia, it's super easy. You just take the turkey, cut it on the sides, stuff the vegetables in it, and put it in the oven. And I was like, but Mom, why do I need to cut the sides? And she was like, I'm not really sure, but just call your grandma, call Nonna, because she taught me how to do it. So I put down the phone and called Grandma. Nonna, how do I cook a turkey? And she's like, ooh, Gioia, super easy. Just take the turkey, cut it on the sides, stuff it with the vegetables, and put it in the oven. And I'm like, but Grandma, why do I need to cut it on the sides? And she paused for a moment and she said, oh, actually, that's just because it doesn't fit in my oven. So escaping from our own assumptions can be extremely tricky, especially if they're invisible to us. And perhaps in a work-related context, I'm guilty of it, but I'm wondering in the audience, how many of you are also guilty of, during an implementation project of a digital transformation vision, that you directly followed the same processes of an old system, you directly replicated it in the new system. And perhaps because you had your manager had a sense of urgency, that there's no time, there's no budget to do that. By a raise of hands, has anybody been guilty of doing the same? Great. So the important thing here is to understand that we have assumptions. and we need to make them explicit. So if we borrow from the fields of economics, the great Keynes taught us that the difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones. And we need to be able to see in the first place which are the old ideas that we're following. So that's why I'm taking you through 5 principles that I've learned from space and that we can directly apply in our everyday life. The first one is called the overview effect. That translates to us as zooming out. Now, the overview effect is a word that was coined by the space philosopher Frank White. And basically, it's a tool that conceptualizes something that most humans have never experienced, but almost every astronaut has described to have experienced. And that is seeing. So imagine that you are seeing Earth from outer space, and it becomes this very small dot that you can almost make it disappear if you put a thumb there and you just close your eye. And nevertheless, it keeps on turning. And the only thing that you see is the interconnected ecosystem. Now, most astronauts describe this effect of making them have an inner mental shift of understanding how everything is interconnected. When they see that their whole life is just in this small dot, something in their brain changes. And by being able to zoom out from our projects that oftentimes are just a digital touch point in the overall value chain that is much bigger, it's a bigger ecosystem, it can help us to gain a better sense of purpose of why we're doing it and why the user, for example, is going through it. And we can't all jump on a rocket on a daily basis, but we can use tools. For example, Miro, I'm a big fan of it. And if you pan out the overall value chain and the ecosystems and the different stakeholders that you're working with, then you can have a similar effect of the overview effect. So from the general ecosystem, whenever you can just zoom out into the details, like the details of my credit card in this example. And the beautiful thing about this is that when you put your digital ecosystem in the context of the value chain, then you have to bring experts from the different fields into the same room. And when you have experts in different fields, having to question the assumptions, the very basic things, becomes normal, becomes easier to do. It's less embarrassing because you know that you are not the technical person in it. So it allows you to create this mental space to ask the stupid questions. The second principle is something that I learned from the spacesuit design. And for us, in the context of a workplace, it translates into identifying the core problem. So imagine that you are an astronaut and you have to wear a suit. So a spacesuit is an extremely complex piece of tech. And it needs to be used in space. And on top of that, it needs to be used by a human. So imagine that you're wearing a spacesuit. You are moving with no gravity in space, and you need to use it under an extreme usability condition, space. On top of that, you are wearing gloves and you have limited visibility because of the helmet. So imagine when you have to fix something outside the ISS, outside the International Space Station. Everything that is surrounding you, including the suits, needs to have been developed to be used by a human, despite being such a complex environment. So you have to break down what is it that you actually need to do, because if you focus on everything else, the complexity of keeping you alive, you can just get lost in the details. So it's about identifying that if you look at a complex problem from the point of view of a human, it narrows you down to having to be simple and ensuring that the solution is dictated by simplicity and not by the complexity. And oftentimes we do it the other way around. Our solutions are dictated by the complexity of the environment that we work with. A good example of trying to identify our assumptions around the complexity is given by SpaceX. Now, SpaceX, when they started to look at the rockets, they didn't question what could we do incrementally better. They actually stripped down all the truths about rockets, a rocket ship, and they identified that the very problem is that rockets are disposable. So that's exactly like saying that the airplane that took you here to London has now been thrown away. It's basically the equivalent. And all the other airplanes that have ever taken you anywhere in the world, thrown away as well. That's absolutely nuts. So let's continue to identify the core problem and ensuring that the complexity of it is looked at from a point of view of a human. In the same way, when we're looking at our workplace, this can be very much arguable, but don't look at the complexity of what the overall system can do. Just focus on a listening tour first. So talk to the people that use it. Understand what 20% of the features are being used for. Who are the 80% of the people that use it? And why are they doing that? And once you focus on what are the problems that the users identify as being their first problems, then you can look at different ways of solving it. Third principle, the delayed connectivity problem in space that for us translates into, hopefully, a new concept that is designing for autonomy. Let me explain this a little bit more. So the International Space Station has been created about 20 years ago. And when we did that, when it was developed, it was necessary for the safety of the crew to be in constant contact with mission control. Now, when we're thinking about long-term missions in space, we're talking about 2-3 years before we even start the mission. So we really need to develop technologies for space that enable astronauts to be autonomous, not to rely on constant mission control communication. The European Space Agency is also focusing on how can we design habitats for astronauts that might get disabled on the way to Mars. Because if something happens just on the way there, first of all, you might have a human that cannot do anything and is lost in space. So we need to start to design for autonomy in space. And how can we do that also for apps, for example, on Earth? A lot of the design principles that we've used so far to design apps has been to create a sort of partial attention, create distractions with the notifications that are coming up. Now, the image is not really relevant, but you understand that having autonomy when you are able to focus, for example, at work, instead of having to juggle through different interfaces, how can we, on top of the user experience, ensure that we can design for autonomy, for deep work, for reflection on what we're doing and why we're doing it? I don't have an answer for that, but I'm trying to be a strong advocate for it and making sure that we don't give it for granted anymore that we have to design for distractions, but we can change that paradigm to try to design for autonomy of our users as well. The fourth principle, the principle that I like the most because it's what it got me to the space industry in the first place and what makes me call myself a time designer nowadays. So when I joined the space mission, I joined to understand how does our perception of time change in a context of no light, isolation, and so on. And we soon realized after starting the mission, after the whole excitement of starting kind of faded away, that our days would just start to warp together inevitably. Every day felt like the same. So we started to create different time units that would make sense for us. For example, the things that we did for the first time, or the things that we did outside the routine, or seeing the visual evolutions of the prototypes that we were working with. The amount of disgust that grew on our hair as we weren't allowed to shower because we needed to save the water supply. In the same way, corporates have tried to experiment with the different time units. For example, Swatch, I don't know if you ever came across this, but in the 90s, they came up with the idea of having internet time. So a time zone that you can navigate independently of the time zone that you were part of. Or perhaps more recently, Meta came up with the idea of time well spent. So ensuring that people weren't just staring at their phones, but they actually interacted with the videos or the content that they saw, so they could define it as time well spent. Or the mythological work they work with, I hope that is going to come in my life soon. But the problem is that we and leaders should start to look at time management as not as an individual problem, but rather institutionally, because it's deeply rooted in the corporate culture that we're part of. Just think about the meeting culture that you have in your own company. So we need to start to question how could we find different time units that are more relevant to us as employees, the people that make up the company essentially. And you can think of different units, for example, the intensity that you work with, the amount of iterations that you do, the amount of celebrations that you celebrate with your team, or the milestones that you achieve. Otherwise, in a project that lasts 2 to 3 years, the only thing that your teammates or your employees are going to remember are the amount of reorganizations, the amount of people that got fired. I personally found that measuring time in intensity is what drives me. I call it living in width. That's why white time. And instead of measuring time in length, I'm now measuring it in width. And I call it living for the amplevity of it. Amplevity being ample, wide. And I oppose it to longevity, which connotates a long but linear life, whilst amplevity is about gaining so much perspective, so many different points of views, that it makes you feel like you've lived wider than just one lifespan. Which leads me to the last principle, and that is creating new words to create new logics. Whether it's the overview effect, it's amplevity, it's white time, words are often an underestimated tool to be able to express something and to help you collaborate even further, to get the ideas further in the development of it. Now, I would like to do a little exercise with you. And I would like you to close your eyes. And I'll tell you when to open them again. I promise I will not pull a prank on any of you. Don't worry. Now, imagine that you are a fish. And we're going back billions of years. You're actually the first fish in the entire planet that is taking a step outside the water. You're moving around with your proto-legs, and you explore the world around you. You observe the landscapes. You breathe in the fresh air. And after a while out there, you decide to return. How would you describe to your fellow fish the landscapes that you've seen? How would you describe the sounds that you've heard? And how would you describe that drag towards the soil that you felt? And most importantly, how will they understand the importance of what you've done? I want you to open up your eyes again. And yes, that was sounds of underwater. You can open your eyes again. Yeah. So the importance of words is essential. And I think that as designers, we've all felt the need for it. I personally experienced when I told my grandma I was going to switch from studying economics to study design. And she was kind of disappointed because she thought I was going to start making pretty vases. That's because being from Italy, in a non-native English-speaking country, design is often associated to something static, something beautiful, something aesthetically pleasing. But actually, in English, design is a verb. It's something more dynamic. It's about planning, disrupting, creating, developing. And we don't always get it. So the ability to create new words can help you create new mental models in people's mental models that you're talking with. And it doesn't need to be too complex. I started by creating some post-its and mixing up different words. In this example, we were working with an innovation hub in a corporate and trying to work with policymakers to understand that the environment around them could be improved. So we tried to mix their daily words together. Stakeholders for the corporates and landscapes for the policymakers. Stakescape holders. It doesn't need to be perfect, but it's a good step forward. And if it's not about words, you can always use visuals. So Einstein theorized that time goes slower the closer to a strong gravitational field. The physics behind it, it's mind-boggling, but visually, it can explain a lot more. So these are the 5 principles that I'm using as an organizational change manager almost every day. And you don't have to use all of them. You don't have to use them sequentially. You can just cherry pick what makes sense to you. Because as designers, you are part of the change making as well. It's not just about developing something, it's also about implementing it. So the overview effect, thrive or strive to zoom out to get the sense of purpose, the overarching value chain. And from the spacesuit design, understand what is the actual problem that you are developing for. Are you getting lost in the complexity of it, or is there an actual value for the person that you're going to be delivering it to? And design for autonomy. Think about Mars, basically. How can we ensure that what we're designing for, a product of the future, is going to enable us to think deeper, to keep our characteristic of a human, being able to think? And rethink time. Don't give for granted that we're supposed to measure time in hours or minutes. And create new words to create new logics. Now, it's not finished yet. And if we got until here and you're thinking, interesting, cool, maybe I can apply it, maybe not, it's still a bit too abstract, I want to share a clip with you of Tony Robbins, probably someone that you've seen on a business magazine, or maybe thought he was a scammer, or maybe you've indulged in one of his motivational speeches on YouTube. And I want you to listen to it. I love this clip, and I often think about it. But the way that I think about it is that I associate it to banana trees. Now, banana trees are interesting because in Denmark, banana trees are very exotic. If you have a banana tree in your home, everybody is going to recognize it as soon as they're going to step in your house. But if you live in the Caribbean, or if you take an airplane to the Caribbean or to Madeira, like in this case in Portugal, banana trees are everywhere. They're so common that people barely notice them. Apples are exotic there. You should have seen the face of the taxi driver when I asked him to take a picture of me like this in front of the banana tree. that was very weird to him. Did I never see a banana tree? No, in fact, I had never seen a banana tree outside the one in my apartment. So there is one message that I would like you to take away from this talk today. And if it's not the 5 principles, is this key. Strive to create patterns where others see the ordinary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that talk. I liked how you come from such a different angle talking about space, but it's completely relatable. Any questions? Yeah.
Questions, but not really about design. So how was
That's fine, but if you use the mic, thanks.
Sorry, this is Howie again. I'm just curious to know more about your experience within the 2 weeks of darkness, because obviously you started the process, you're kind of in there, time was warped. I'm sure it becomes like longer than it is on the outside. How at the end of it, how did you sort of deal with it, and what was the psychological effect to you?
I think it was extremely interesting. And one thing specifically that I would have never imagined that was, let's say, possible, was that after 2 weeks in this confined environment with no access to natural light, it took us 2 days for our eyes to adapt to lens, because one of the other crew members had a car, and even by looking around him, he could not get the perception of how far things were, because our eyes had gotten used to such things closer to us. And the feeling of fresh air just going in your hair, it was something outside this world. It was very fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you.
I can't help but think, so the moral of the story is, if you are locked in for 2 weeks, you get a better appreciation for life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
But also for being able to do the things that you want. Again, we were following a very strict routine. And after the first 2 days, you already couldn't name the amount of days that we had been there for, except, as I was saying, for the things that we were doing randomly. Like we had to train every day to keep our, like, literally, we were forced to keep our mental health in balance. And we decided to play different types of music every day so that we could recognize what was going on. So one day we were just like using these tools for training with classical music playing extremely loud in the background. That's something that I will never forget. I would have felt like Beethoven, but just training.
Cool. Any more questions? Yeah, at the back. I'll go to you next.
James here again. Thank you for an excellent presentation. My question is whether you have any advice on creating a working environment that is more accepting of change, or whether it's just brute perseverance.
Yeah, I think that, as I think I mentioned it, if I didn't skip any lines, but we often think of change as something very big, but oftentimes the ability to create this mental space for people to change is in the small things that you do. So simply celebrating things, that's a huge issue that we forget to celebrate. It enables you to make people understand that what they're doing is recognized by the company, and it gives you more flexibility for trying something out, because then you're not punished for trying something out. But if it goes well, it's rewarded. If it's not, people are not even gonna complain. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So one thing I just wanted to say is, like, when I say what my work is, I always say I'm an experienced designer, although I mostly worked on digital products. And one thing I find difficult when working with any sort of company or client is that they always come to you with a feature they need to do or with a problem. And you're like, do we need to do a feature? Even though, or do we need to make an app, even though I might lose the job for it? But it's like, what is the problem? Can we make it non-digitally? So I feel there's always this sort of, we are kind of pushing and to make them digital, maybe for justifying us being there doing that job when we could solve it in many other ways. So that, I think, it's one of the problem in the industry today. And yeah, I'm do you ever think about this, like
Whether to make something digital or physical?
yeah, like when someone comes to you saying, no, we won't make it digital, but then you have all the, you know, POs and all the developers, and you're like, no, we are not needed, we can do it differently, we can do a educational program, for example, or, you know, there is that complexity, I think, today.
Yeah, I haven't experienced that directly, but for example, when you receive a brief from a client, that's part of questioning the assumptions, helping them understand that maybe that's not exactly what they're looking for. That's just a symptom of what the actual problem is and how there could be other ways of solving it. But I think it's a lot about also the narrative that you create around the problem that you are identifying. Because if you create a narrative that sounds threatening to them, then they will be resistant immediately. But if you create a narrative in a way that follows the initial thoughts that they might have had, then you have directly their buy-in. Just like I was saying before, putting people from different parts of the value chain, it can really help you to get down to the very root of the problem, because then you have different perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I don't know if anybody else in the audience actually wants to add to that. Yeah.
Hi, Osnor from Genomics England. I think one of it brings to mind an example, and this might also be different based on whether you're in-house or you're doing it from an agency point of view. But my team was tasked to, we weren't actually tasked to, we poked our nose in it, but we heard about some technology wanting to be deployed in one of the labs we were working with. And the stakeholders believed that deploying a bot in the admin process would actually shorten time. We had a hunch that that may not happen, but we didn't have any proof that that was actually the case. Going in to say we want to do research to understand and prove that you're wrong was definitely not the leading way that we did it. But we said, let us help you understand the context within which your solution is going to live, so that your solution can be more, you know, pointed and useful. And genuinely, we didn't know, so data was needed. So when we did the research, it, you know, transpired that that product was actually going to work, because a lot of the issues were human process issues, not tech issues. But being able to kind of pivot what you're leading with and what your intention is was a really helpful thing for us, and it helped to buy in, like the stakeholder buy-in in that particular example, and they didn't really. There wasn't anything to refute at the end of it, because we were able to do the research and they saw the results of the research. And it didn't take us too long then to convince them that tech wasn't needed there. But I can imagine that going a different way somewhere else in another organization, for example.
I want to add to that, because like I've worked in fintech, for example, and I'm not sure if you're using Revolut, the app. Anyway, it was great and amazing until they started putting all the crypto, and they're promoting every sort of product that I do not care about, really. And when working in fintech, I remember most of the times I was receiving tasks to put other new features and, you know, the engagement in a fintech app. I was like, guys, people just want to go there and just see the money and do things, not just being engaged by your features. So, you know, there's always, because we need to keep, you know, growing and expanding, scaling, and just, you know, making more profit. But then it's like going against the user and, you know, all the other things. So it's very complex to push back sometimes, although I do it. But yeah, it's that now Revolut is just a promoting tool in which you have just few things where you can actually see your finances, which is not, you know, the direction companies should be taking. And that's it.
Right. So I'm going to let us go for a break. Thank you again for your talk. Really great.